created this pandemic threat are the real danger facing America today. So let's look what exactly is the so-called bird flu. Let's look at it scientifically for just a minute. The bird flu is simply a slang term, folks, given to a specific strain of influenza virus. Specifically in biochemical terms, biological terms, is called H5N1 because of its RNA and DNA structure. The H5N1 virus, folks, is indeed unique to birds. Virologists have long determined, now this is going back to the 1910s, 1920s, that H5N1 is indeed unique only to birds and is found naturally in most wild bird populations. Typically, it's not a problem with birds. It has zero mortality to the bird population and is absolutely, let me emphasize this, absolutely is not typically passed on to human hosts. Folks, it's only when the bird populations become overstressed due to either massive contamination of their environment or the overpopulation of a bird flock does the cellular terrain of the bird flock change. The internal workings of the birds as a whole change. When the birds become stressed, their internal terrain changes, then this H5N1 virus can in fact become dangerous or even lethal to the bird population. When the bird dies, folks, this virus in fact evolves into a fungal parasite. Let me emphasize, a virus is the seed, the spore of a fungus. That's what a virus is, as opposed to a bacteria, which is a living one-celled organism. Okay, a virus is the microscopic seed or spores of specific funguses. So when the virus evolves and begins to affect a whole bird population, it helps Mother Nature to cull the flock, to bring it back into the balance that is necessary to keep the bird itself, the bird genes itself, intact. The fungal parasite that evolves from the influenza H5N1 really helps to rapidly decompose the bird as well. It's part of nature's plan. The virus and the fungus has been with the bird population since the day they first began to swim and fly. It's part of the system, part of the ecosystem of nature. Should not be feared, should not be something that we should fear as a country, as a nation. So, why all this hype then? What I just said is true, and I absolutely guarantee you that it is true. Why is there such hype over the bird flu? Now, there is a possibility, there is a way that the H5N1 bird influenza virus can infect humans, can become deadly to humans as well. And that is simply when the bird flu H5N1 mutates because of specific environmental toxic loads. Heavy toxins such as PCBs, such as other type of neurotic type of gases. Those type of toxic chemicals can cause mutation, which can jump then from the bird to the human population. Now, these mutations, I got to emphasize, just never do occur naturally. It's only when we see human-introduced toxins, where humans have messed with Mother Nature, basically, that we see these mutations happen. Always keep in mind, when you think about the bird flu, folks, that the so-called H5N1 virus is simply one of over 1,500 naturally benign viruses which are part of nature's life cycle. Did you know there was over 1,500 different viruses that are benign to humans, absolutely benign? from, another example perhaps is the parvovirus of a dog. A puppy gets it, it's deadly to a puppy. Humans have no effect on this virus whatsoever. Just like the parvovirus, H5N1 has indeed been a part of planet Earth for many, many thousands of years without causing massive human deaths or human what's called pandemics. All right? But wait a minute, didn't we have a pandemic in our history back in 1918? Well, yes, we have had, and let me explain that to help you understand that. Because I promise you that you won't hear a talk show host talking about H5N1 bird flu without bringing home the fact that millions of Americans died from a 1918 pandemic. Folks, Americans, human beings, and others all over the world have many different strains of influenza viruses that affect humans negatively. But let me just tell you that. Just like the bird flu in birds, the only time influenza virus becomes deadly to humans is when the human body is toxic as well, when the human cellular terrain is out of balance. So we really shouldn't fear a seasonal influenza virus at all. But Americans have been programmed in our minds, oh golly, we need to get an influenza shot every single winter. The flu season is coming. Line up. Go to your local Mormon church stake center or wherever and get your flu vaccine. Get it done. Once again, only when outside pathogens are introduced to the human terrain do these viral organisms mutate into super deadly toxins. Folks, this is the truth you need to know. You've got to know this about the 1918 pandemic. Let's look and see exactly what happened back then. Between the decade of 1900 to 1912, researchers granted and funded by John D. Rockefeller, primarily, began mass vaccination campaigns again in America. But Americans didn't really buy into that. They didn't want to have this vaccine. They thought, well, we don't need this. Why should we have it? Primarily aimed at smallpox, vaccination injections eventually evolved into influenza injections as well. So, while these vaccines were being produced, not many Americans wanted to voluntarily have a needle poked into their arm with some kind of germs being put into them. Well, here's where the first forced or mandatory vaccinations began to plague America. This happened 2 years after the research was basically completed. In 1914, the so-called Great War begins in Europe, which the Great War we know today is World War I. The United States didn't really officially enter World War I until the year 1917. President Wilson eventually declared war on Germany following the pressure put on to him and Congress by the sinking of the Lusitania, the equivalent at that time of the Titanic, a massive, wonderfully built and equipped luxury cruise liner. This was sunk by German U-boats, and great outrage occurred in the United States and Britain over that sinking. When the U.S. finally entered the war on the side of Great Britain and France, in early 1917, the nation of Spain allowed the United States military to establish training bases on Spanish soil. This is important to understand when you realize that the 1918 virus pandemic was called the Spanish flu. This is the key to understanding where it got its name from, where it originated from in Spain. It originated specifically from the Spanish bases, U.S. military bases in Spain. As part of the mobilization for the war effort, in the spring and summer of 1917, America goes into full production of war material. Bullets, tanks, machine guns, all these new little mechanized warfare inventions were produced. For the first time, American men are drafted, forced basically, into military service, and then deployed for training in bases in Spain. This is very important to understand. For the very first time in U.S. history, all new recruits, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, all new recruits are given mandatory vaccinations, one of which is a very broad influenza vaccination. Now, these servicemen did not have a choice. Either they got the vaccination or they went to the brig for 5 or 10 years of incarceration. The tragedy is, to me, the manufacturer of this forced vaccine was a man named John D. Rockefeller, who made literally millions of dollars in vaccine sales to the U.S. government. At the same time, because of what happened in World War I, Rockefeller greatly consolidated Standard Oil contracts worldwide. Rockefeller made billions, billions, and billions from his contract and war profiteering that he did. And I'm going to show you specifically what happened at that time. So, the influenza pandemic of 1918 officially began at the Spanish training bases in Spain in 1918. Between 1918 and 1920, it's estimated that 50 million people worldwide died. For what? How did this pandemic begin and what caused it? Let's take a look at it. I challenge any public health researcher, any medical doctor, any vaccine purveyor and injector. I challenge them publicly to show me where this information is false, where it is misleading, where it is untrue. I challenge you publicly to debate this. Following the mass vaccination injections in the U.S. soldiers, the soldiers within 2 to 3 weeks of the vaccines are all crowded into troop convoy ships and sent to train in Spain. Entering into these closed quarters bunks with rough seas caused many to become seasick. They become very stressed. They know they're going to war. They're not happy leaving their family, leaving their loved ones. Many of them have never been away from home. They're homesick as well. The stress and the reaction to these untested vaccines was evident in the death rate of soldiers even making the voyage across. It was unprecedented in sickness, full-blown flu symptoms ranging from diarrhea to chronic constant vomiting, headache, fever, and chills was the norm, not the exception, in those troop convoys and troop ships heading overseas. All you have to do is read letters home, read journals, diaries, entries of these soldiers, and it was literal hell in that 6 weeks of mobilization. So, when you got the massive vaccinations of influenza and then having the stress of the terrain of these young recruits aged 18 to 34, again, 18 years of age to 34 years of age, we see now that they've got the flu being passed back and forth to each other. And each time it passes forth, there's a little bit of mutations going on. And then the U.S. soldiers hit the bases of Spain. And what happened there? Immediately after arriving in Spain, the U.S. soldiers are trained for the various forms of toxic gases they will experience in the trenches in France. Reports had it that drill sergeants at 4 o'clock in the morning to the sleeping sick men in their barracks bunks, would throw live canisters of gas, and an alarm would ring, and they would jump immediately, getting into their gas masks and protective suits. But you see, they had enough time to breathe in small amounts of these toxic mustard gases and different forms of experimental gases. And again, that is what caused the mucous membranes in the lung material and the virus that was infecting the lungs to mutate into what is arguably the deadliest form of influenza virus the world has ever seen, and probably will ever see again. Exposure to these toxic chemical gases, in fact, caused the live cell influenza virus cells to mutate into the extremely lethal form of the virus that we now know as the 1918 pandemic. Tragedy, absolutely. Millions of young, healthy men and women aged 18 to 34 die worldwide as a result of the vaccinations in combination with this unnatural, highly toxic chemical exposure. Folks, there was not a single American family in the year 1918, 1919 that did not have a friend or loved one aged 18 to 34 die. Every family in America bought black wreaths at this time. Absolutely tragic. Again, absolutely the cause of a bad vaccine. Now, this truth will never be told to you on the CBS Evening News, but it is absolutely true nevertheless. Something that everybody in America needs to understand today. So what happened following the defeat of Germany? Well, as is commonly the case, the victor nations, and specifically the bankers that made the loans to both sides, the heads of the various multinational banks, in fact, met in conference in San Remo, Italy in 1924 for the purpose of placing war reparations on the German Empire, German and Austria, which was massive. They had massive wealth and holdings across Europe. John D. Rockefeller and the Rothschild families at this time, they greatly consolidated their wealth because, you see, they funded both sides of the conflict at the time. Soon after 1924, John D. Rockefeller officially forms a French oil conglomerate. He did this on March 28th of 1924 and named it Total. And it was very literally the French Company of Petroleums, also known as CFP, Company of French Petroleum. Rockefeller's Total Company then was then awarded a controlling interest, what Deutsche Bank had the stock, in what was then known as the Turkish Petroleum Company, located in Baghdad. Let me just re-emphasize a little bit of World War I history. The Archduke of Austria that was assassinated, the main warring parties in World War I, the main ally of Germany and Austria was what was then called the Ottoman Empire, which included the nation-state of Turkey, Greece, Iraq, Iran, and all of Persia at that time. And in fact, all of the Middle East was in part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Now, as part of the breaking up of the interests of the losing faction, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, was broken up into multinational companies. The Turkish Petroleum Company, which was the massive, really the only real, this is what's so funny, it's the only real competitor to Rockefeller Standard Oil worldwide. This was their main competitor, and because of the war reparations, it all fell like a low-hanging plum right into Rockefeller's hands. And it became known as the Iraq Petroleum Company, This company was eventually nationalized by Saddam Hussein around 1990, which led to a lot of bitter infighting with Rockefeller interests and George Herbert Walker Bush. This is why George Bush Sr. had a vendetta against Saddam Hussein more than anybody else. Today, 2008, Total Inc. is a true multinational mega military industrialist corporation. Total operates offices in more than 130 countries worldwide, and folks, has over 110,000 employees. Not surprisingly, two of Total's prime wholly owned subsidiaries, research team member, Taubenberg's team member, Johann Holton, finds and sends a remarkably well-preserved 1918 flu virus specimen from a frozen body killed by the 1918 flu to Dr. Taubenberger's lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Now, again, he found this virus from a victim of the 1918 flu that was buried in a shallow grave in the permafrost and never really thought out. It was like putting it in an incubator, a frozen container. The virus's RNA-based gene fragments were analyzed by computer sequencing in order to reveal the complete genetic code. Even with the supercomputer, this code sequencing will take years to complete. In October of 2003, Taubenberger's team finally deciphers the deadly virus's entire genetic code and completes the 6-year project. Noted virologist and Taubenberger colleague R.G. Webster, in the same month, publishes an article in American Scientist magazine where the article declares, quote, "The world is teetering on the edge of a flu pandemic that could kill a large fraction of the human population," end quote. November of 2003, just a month later, George W. Bush issues Executive Order number 13295 on bioterrorism. Remember what happened right after September 11th? Right after that, we had smallpox vaccines that were given to the troops that were contaminated. Do you remember that? Do you also remember what happened? There was some anthrax spores, weapons-grade anthrax that originated from Fort Detrick, somehow got mailed to certain members of Congress and certain members of the media, created quite a panic and terror at that time. Americans were uncertain what to think. Oh golly, we just got attacked by terrorism. We're now engaged in a war on terror. We're out invading now Afghanistan. And in 2003, we just invaded Iraq because of the war on terror, right? So George W. Bush issues an executive order, number 13295, entitled Bioterrorism. In this executive order, President Bush makes individual American citizens subject to, quote, unrestricted apprehension and detention, end quote. When? In the event of an outbreak of disease in the public sector. For the first time, Americans can be rounded up and apprehended and incarcerated, just like what's going on right now in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, just because there's an outbreak of disease in American soil. A year and a half later, 18 months later, in April 2005, something really interesting happens. George W. Bush amends the language of his 2003 Executive Order 13295, specifically detailing the event that would make individuals, quote, subject to unrestricted apprehension and detention, and that event is specifically amended to state, quote, influenza caused by novel or re-emergent influenza viruses that are causing or have the potential to cause a pandemic. Let me again re-emphasize. Here's his executive order, making individual American citizens subject to arrest without trial, detention for as long as is deemed necessary. For what? For influenza caused by a novel, which means new, or re-emergent influenza virus. Okay, here we find the timeline. Bush amends his executive order in April. Well, guess what happens in August? August 2005, the team in Fort Detrick inserts plasmids into human kidney cells, which then transfers human DNA into the 1918 virus, making it human-specific now. The deadly 1918 virus that killed millions and millions of people, and which nature reversed by itself from its deadly nature, is now militarized and ready for use by conspiring men in August of 2005. A month later, September 9th, 2005, the United Nations in New York City. Now let me again, the UN is largely Rockefeller envisioned, and Rockefeller himself, John D., and his family are what donated the land in New York, and built the actual United Nations Center now. It's a Rockefeller-controlled institution. The UN in New York City issues a shocking worldwide press release on September 9th of 2005. Here in this press release, they introduce a man named David Nabarro as, quote, the UN System Senior Coordinator for Avian, Human Influenza. 20 days later, on September 29th of 2005, fear and panic officially began worldwide when Nabarro, on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly, issues what's called, quote, an official UN warning that, quote, an outbreak of avian influenza would kill between 5 million and 150 million people on each continent. Not may, not could, not has the potential to. No, he says would kill. Well, the next month, ex-Utah Governor Mike Leavitt jumps into the battle. President Bush's newly appointed Secretary of Health and Human Services, Michael Okerlund Leavitt of Utah, officially begins the pandemic bird flu preparations in earnest. In December of 2005, Bush solicits Congress for $7.1 billion to fund his preparations. Only $3.3 billion is immediately allocated to Leavitt, however. The Health and Human Services, the HHS, what I call the candy store, is now officially open for business, and let the propaganda games begin. January 2006, Leavitt officially launches his website called pandemicflu.gov. Here he declares, quote, let me be clear. It is only a matter of time before we discover H5N1 in America. The migration patterns of the wild fowl that carry the virus makes its appearance here almost inevitable. Governor Leavitt, Secretary Leavitt, for heaven's sakes, H5N1 is already here. You take any virologist and study the blood and structure of the bird population, H5N1 in its non-toxic, non-lethal state is already here. It's already here in Utah. It's already here in America. It's just not going to affect humans. It hasn't before, and without help from you, it never will. January 2006, Mike Levitt goes over to Beijing, to China, because a Chinese host was called, quote, the International Pledging Conference on Avian and Human Influenza in Beijing. The purpose? China is extracting massive sums of money from the West. Levitt commits $334 million to Communist China in funds to aid China's research into what? Quote, vaccine development.